Hi, this is Curt Robbins with Higher Learning LV in Las Vegas, and welcome to Curt's Cannabis Corner. This week, we're talking about Connecticut, the 19th state to legalize adult use cannabis. And I've got some of the typical folks in the room, Mr. David Rheins from the Marijuana Business Association in Seattle.
Very
Also,
typical.
well, not a typical hat, though. You're bringing some spice to the game today. And Alana Armstrong from the Aldous PR agency in Toronto.
Doing well, Curt. Thanks for having us back for another talk. Looking forward to getting into it on Connecticut.
And we have another industry expert in the room that we've never had before, Mr. John Bailey, who is an entrepreneur from Las Vegas. He's worked with some companies you've heard of like Da Vinci, got a lot of exciting things going on. Welcome, John.
Hey, thank you for having me. Really appreciate being here.
Well, as is our tradition, Mr. Rheins, what do you think about this whole 19th state to legalize adult use, Connecticut? What's going on here?
I think Connecticut is huge news. Number one, because it completes the trifecta. Connecticut is really part of the tri-state group, which includes New York and New Jersey. Folks who live in any of those three states tend to work or vacation or shop in their neighboring state. So they really have to have policies that are comprehensive. And this policy is bleeding edge in terms of social equity, in terms of consumer rights and consumption opportunities. I think it's a model for mainstreaming marijuana.
I'm glad you bring that up. Some people are shocked to learn that there are more progressive clauses and sections in this law than California or Oregon or Washington, where you live.
I think it's interesting. The West Coast, while we were early to the cannabis party, really starting in the mid 90s with, some state sanctioned activity, really has been much more conservative. I mean, I think it's interesting that California wasn't the first state to go fully legal. And I think what's happened over the subsequent 7 or 8 years that we've been building this industry is that each successive state, each market learns lessons from the past and vicariously applies those lessons without having to repeat the same mistakes.
Right. Mr. Bailey in Las Vegas, what do you think about Connecticut?
Being in Vegas, we obviously saw this way back 2018, 2017, that progression really moving. And I've sat in a lot of town hall meetings down at City Hall, talking about consumption lounges, talking about different things that we're doing. I would hope that as states are coming online, they're starting to learn from us. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Connecticut. Because if you look at in the same two other states that just opened up in the last, moved forward with their legalization process in the last month, Virginia and New Mexico, but Virginia, heavily, really, almost the contrast of what Connecticut looks like right now, whereas they won't even look at retail sales till 2024. And so they're out on we really don't want this, but we're trying to focus on criminality. Whereas I think Connecticut, being in that tri-state area, being in that forefront, is really setting pace and saying, we're going to do this in a way that looks smart. I'm just looking at it going wow, you're really adopting a lot more that's on the flyers of this, being in Vegas, we have heavy tourism here. We weren't really set up in the beginning very well. And even being in those city hall meetings and listening to, our lawmakers, they were asking more for help because they didn't really know how to structure these things. So I think that smart move on Connecticut to really come out bold.
Right. Alana, what is your perspective on Connecticut from Toronto, from Ontario, from Canada? You're in a completely different federally regulated system.
It's nice to see the northeastern states, which are, some of the ones closest to where I am, legalized one by one. I think it's cute to David's point about consumers in that area shopping between states, shopping their neighbor state. I have a lot of hope for the progressiveness of this bill. By most accounts, this is the best bill so far.
Exactly. There are tenant rights built into it. Possession limits are significantly higher than many other states that, just like Dave was saying, just a couple of years ago, we considered them the leading edge. They were the most progressive. And here we've got what in some respects is, in a conservative part of the country, it's obviously mixed, but there are a lot of conservative undercurrents there. They're running right in front of the leaders, Washington, Oregon, and California.
So I think it's interesting politically. If you look at Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey, I would suggest Connecticut is the most conservative of the three, the most moneyed. It's where after you made all your money in New York, you moved to Connecticut, right? In these big places. And not only are they embracing it, and I'll use the word fast tracking it, whereas New York is kind of slow walking it, and Jersey has slow walked their system. Connecticut is saying, hey, we're smaller than you other two guys, and we want to come to market first. We don't want to lose the revenue. Connecticut has the most aggressive social equity components in its laws to date. I believe 50% of all licensees in the first 3 years have to go to disenfranchised communities.
That's amazing. Who does that?
Amazing, 50%. And those social equity participants will only pay 50% of the fees. So they really are bending over backwards, not just to make a political statement, to really build meaningful opportunity for heretofore disenfranchised communities.
Let's talk about how Connecticut might influence future states, because it's number 19, but we've got 50 states. So we talk a lot about the states that have already legalized. What about the forthcoming states? What do you think about that, Mr. Bailey?
They're positioning themselves to really set some trends and really set some narratives that other states can pick up and build from. Again, was crash coursing through the first half of 2010s and coming to this adoption and I don't want to say like an immature way, but it lacked the progression and really that traction that was going to make that successful. So you still have a lot of people on both sides of the conversation. I think that Connecticut coming out bold and strong is going to encourage other states that haven't come online to really look at their programs and see what benefit they can give back to their community.
Well, peer pressure is a real psychological dynamic. So hopefully future states, regardless of where they are, decide to look at Connecticut as a positive example. I like the fact that it's really blowing some of the numbers out of the water because it's getting a lot of press because of that.
For other states that haven't come online yet, they're missing out on the revenues. We can't ignore that the revenue, the money to give back to our systems and communities is strong.
You know, I'd like to introduce the notion of regionality, because we talked about the tri-states, New York, New Jersey's coming online, really put pressure. Connecticut had to come online or their citizenry would just go spend tax dollars next door. So half of the crew here is from Vegas today. Vegas is very much influenced by California. I'm up in Seattle, or, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, Montana are very much related in terms of our development. You're seeing in the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio kind of developing in league, and then Oklahoma coming in and putting huge pressure on Texas, forming. Even Louisiana had to reform. So there's a lot of political pressure from within these regions because the citizenry is fluid in those regions and the consumption patterns and investment patterns are similar. So I think that's a really interesting topic, because we'll go from what I'll call a balkanized hyper-local market into a regional market before we transition into a federal and then international marketplace.
International marketplace. That would have sounded insane 10 years ago, Dave. No.
Well, it would have sounded criminal 10 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think the UN would have had some words to say about the US as the world's drug dealer, or the world's weed dealer.
We are the world's drug dealer, by the way. So we're just following in our daddy's footsteps. There's really nothing different here.
That's a good way of saying it. We're talking about Connecticut in the context of both progressive legislation and also the fact that we are inching up on half of U.S. states having adult use cannabis laws in
46%. 46% of all citizens now.
I think it was very powerful when Colorado legalized years ago, and then we started seeing some headlines with large dollar amounts in terms of tax revenue. And I thought, I wonder if other states are going to get a little jealous, quite honestly. And the citizenry, especially when they get hard up for cash and they're in a deficit, is going to say, might we want to legalize adult use?
What are they doing with the cash? That's the other thing that Connecticut has apportioned significant, I think 75% for the first, and I think it's the first 3 years, right, that they put these provisions in. Of those, cannabis revenues will be earmarked for social equity programming.
Yeah, and it's nice that Connecticut was able to say up front not only where they were going to put their revenue, where they were going to reinvest their revenue, but making investments up front. What David was saying earlier about giving people that wouldn't otherwise have the income to start a store the chance to start a store. And so those investments up front, as well as talking about what they will do with the revenue after the fact. Most states only really got to talk about what they were going to do with the revenue after the fact. So that's kind of one of the key differences.
Because in the early years, Curt, you talked about Colorado. I remember Hickenlooper, who was not for legalization, by the way. In fact, in the early days when we came out and we legalized and we said, hey, we're going to generate significant revenues, and folks are coming to Colorado as a pot tourist destination.
Right.
And Hickenlooper came out and said, we don't want to be a pot tourist destination. And he has changed his tune. And now that he's taken the national stage, has adopted legalization as if it were his own idea.
One thing that's very interesting about the Connecticut legislation is that it includes now tell me guys if you've heard of this in any other jurisdiction, but any municipality in Connecticut with a population of 50,000 or more must provide public consumption spaces for cannabis consumers. Now, this I don't think I've ever seen this before.
No, it is nowhere.
How do we think that might manifest? What are some of our ideas here?
Well, we were talking about cannabis consumption lounges last week. You could get a little bit creative with these sorts of spaces and make it a little bit enclosed, but maybe enclosed with some
that's what I was kind of thinking.
Or something, so it's a little bit like a smoker's garden. Passersby don't need to necessarily walk through wafts of cannabis smoke if they don't want to.
Also make it somewhat of a green space and maybe some water features. There's a lot of opportunity there. Yeah, I was thinking at the low end, it could be kind of like a covered bus stop if they really just didn't want to invest anything in it. At the high end, gosh, who knows if they pumped enough money and effort.
Yeah, in my mind, I mean, it's two things. Really taking the lessons from what we've learned in places like Vegas, where tourists came and were dropped off by their MedMen branded taxi to the dispensary, right? Taken to play it at 13, cop their weed, and then left to their own devices. Come back to their hotel and see if you smoke up, you're going to get a $250 cleaning charge. If we catch you on the street, you'll get the same thing. Good luck, right? And don't take it on the plane with you either. So it was a little bit of a catch-22. The second thing is that Connecticut really is going to do it for the revenues. And so you'll see Connecticut casinos, you'll see tourist destinations, you'll see upscale services develop in Connecticut for that very wealthy tri-state marketplace who's looking for those kinds of experiences. So we're doing lots of cannabis and golf out here in the West Coast. I can see that as a huge play in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. There's a company called 420 Golf. There's a whole bunch of them out there. So yeah, what's interesting is all these cannabis entrepreneurs do like to get out on the course.
Right. Golf courses are beautiful. I think it's a classy way for the culture to promote itself.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of people, tossing back a lot of drinks, a lot of flasks, a lot of things where it's like, I'd much rather, be walking through a nice smell of something, for a better word, danky, than drunk people on the course. Like it's sometimes it's that contrast is going to be much more pleasant and peaceful.
You would take purple Urkel over vodka and cigars.
100%, or a good mix of both, but with responsibility. I think
even more significantly in the Connecticut law is the landlord tenant provisions, right? Because even in Colorado, or even in Washington, you sign a lease, and 9 out of 10 times that lease is going to say you cannot consume cannabis here, right? Because they have to adhere to federal housing guidelines and all that kind of stuff. So the fact that tenants are going to be protected to allow them to consume legal cannabis is huge, and that is going to be extended to hotels. Again, unheard of. It's the kind of thing that you would think Vegas would have been the first to have a pot hotel. In your article, Curt, you complain only 25% of hotel rooms. But hell, if you've got 1,000-room hotel, 250 pot smoking rooms is a selection that I'm not unhappy with.
Well, and they'll have to tolerate the growing of cannabis too. 12 plants per household.
So it's a lot. 12 plants. It's not like you've got 12 geranium plants, on your windowsill. The folks I know who grow 12 plants, is a lot. And that's a pretty liberal way to start home grow. We still don't have home grow in Washington State. Oregon has a very liberal. The commercial marketplace is really going through a transition, and home grow will only speed the consolidation and aggregation of the top players for sure.
Alana, tell us about tenant rights in Ontario and to a larger extent Canada, since that's one of the biggest standout provisions here in the Connecticut law.
It's a contentious thing because you see up until now tenants being pushed out or pressured out for consuming or cultivating cannabis in their rented home. Adults are able to grow up to 4 plants per household. It's not being honored by landlords. And there's a lot of friction right now, especially because there is a big premium on housing right now.
Wow, that's sad. The tenant rights, I think, is an issue in 9 out of 10 cases. Connecticut is really a standout here.
Well, Connecticut just seems like they're treating adults like actual adults.
Yeah, it's the mainstreaming. I think CBD has helped a lot in that mainstreaming. And the fact that the tri-state region is taking the lead in this normalization, because they're approaching it with pharmacists involved, insurance companies involved. They're doing it from a legislative standpoint. We're getting big government, getting granular about normalizing cannabis use and commerce. And that was not how it was done on the West Coast. We got voter initiatives that passed and governments who reluctantly let us have it, and then put on top of it onerous regulations and taxation schemes. It's big money fighting for their place at the table. And those folks have all the time in the world, so they don't care if it comes this year or next year. If they can get an advantageous position, they will kick it down the road. Connecticut, being the smaller of the 3 sisters, is going to say, no, we want to be at the table first. Let's establish the best marketplace, and let's start taking the more populous states. We'll take their consumers, and we'll take their business, and we'll set the model.
I think you're right, Dave, because both the governor and the House Majority Leader in Connecticut were making very overt statements saying that they believe they have the best legislation in the nation. And as I said in the article, they just might. But to your point, how does all this theoretical language actually manifest in the real world, affecting real patients, real consumers, and real businesses?
Connecticut, big, brave, bold, sets forth a narrative for other states that haven't come online to grab onto and build from. I think it's current states that are still struggling with it could look at it and really pull those case studies. So I think that overall they're trending in a very positive way. I really like what they're doing. You can reach me, John, at themindsetgenesis.com, or on the website, www.themindsetgenesis.com.
Thanks, John. We appreciate you coming by. And Mr. Rheins, Connecticut, 19 states. territories.
I think Connecticut is a super important development. It represents the tipping point for legalization as the keystone of the tri-state area. I think it's going to set the stone. It's going to keep the pace for New York and New Jersey.
This is kind of a first. We now have an East Coast state that's more progressive in its embrace of legalized cannabis than many of the West Coasters. So things are changing. Well, that's another episode of Curt's Cannabis Corner. I'd like to thank Alana Armstrong with Aldous in Toronto, John Bailey, an entrepreneur in Las Vegas, and of course, the one and only David Rheins, executive director of the MJBA in beautiful Seattle. That's episode 11. We'll see you next week.